Welcome everyone to this module, which I consider to probably be one of the most helpful that I can create for many of you going through new hire training. As a matter of fact, this is something that is an important review for many others who have been through this maneuver in the past. This will be on an engine failure at a very specific point of V1, VR, and extremely low visibility, minimum low visibility for takeoff. Now, with that, I want you to understand too that this is a simple engine failure. When you have this condition that you may have in training, it may be more serious with a severe engine damage, a fire, any of those considerations, which will not negate what I'm going to be talking about here in terms of a severe engine failure. An engine fire would have some different aspects to it. We can cover those kinds of things at later modules. But an engine failure or a severe engine damage, what I'm about to cover here would be the same for both of those situations and conditions. I want to emphasize that handling this situation really requires a knowledge of technique. There may be several techniques. I'm going to teach one here that has worked in all my years of training and for me personally in this particular situation. Now, the one thing that I really want to cover here is that this would be a very rare real-life event where you have an engine failure precisely at V1 VR while still on the runway. And I want to emphasize that makes this you're on the runway and you must safely get the aircraft airborne off of the runway. And there are some circumstances here that are really important about being able to do that, which is what I'm going to cover. Now, what isn't an unusual situation or is more likely to happen is you may have an engine failure after you're airborne between V1, VR, and V2 or sometime after you're airborne. Now, keep in mind that what I'm going to cover here is where V1 and VR are very close to one another. Recognize in some takeoff situations, what I'm going to cover here is going to be even more critical because obviously, as you know, there are times where you have a V1 that is well below VR. When I say well below, it could be 5 knots, it could be as much as 10, 12 knots. So this makes that particular situation even more critical. Now the thing is, even though it's a rare real-life event, this must be performed to proficiency for qualification during training at, I believe it would be any airline, certainly the airlines that I was involved in. And that is making this takeoff safely at the lowest of visibilities for takeoff. And of course now they're really low, down around 500, 300 RVR. So there's something very unique weather conditions that you have to deal with in this failure on the runway, and we'll cover those. I want to make a couple of remarks about this too. One of the things here that is very much a unique nature in this maneuver. When I have an engine failure with good visibility, I can look out the forward windshield and I can discern and have a good view of what an alignment is of the runway. When you're in this visibility situation, you don't have that. And this is going to require some techniques, which I'll cover here, which will get you safely off the ground if you use them. What this really boils down to are some human factors that, just what I have to do in this situation is really understand the uniqueness of this versus what is a kind of normal training mentality. This requires a knowledge of what you're dealing with and how human factors can distract you from some adjustments that you have to make this maneuver successful. So we're going to consider those techniques that will be discussed in this module. And that's primarily, and I want to truly emphasize over and over again, the key to this maneuver being safely and successfully initiated is the alignment prior to and during the initial rotation. This is critical, which I'm sure you can understand, but there's a unique situation as humanoids that we need to adjust to for that alignment. And then the same with the initial rotation. And I'll cover those, and if you feel that they're appropriate, really use them. And I would encourage you, for most of you that are in airline training, you're going to be able to go get some devices that the fidelity is correct, the reactions to the failure is correct, and you'll be able to practice these. And then in some succeeding modules, I'm going to go through the flow pattern steps to climb and flap retraction, and after flap retraction, the stabilization, and some real-world considerations following getting the aircraft cleaned up and stabilized. Now, the one thing that I want to explain here with my presentation, in my simulation module, I don't get realistic reactions, but I got something close here. My simulation model doesn't give me an opportunity to precisely have an engine failure right at V1. It's just strictly on timing, and I can't really get that accomplished precisely. So I have some anomalies here that I do want to point out. And that is, at an engine failure at V1, this engine indication here is not realistic. It would be at a much higher rotation of N1, and this indication right here, back here at 9% N1, is not realistic. The other thing that isn't realistic for what I produced here, but I can use it, and if you've seen my previous models on using fuel flow on the operating engine, that is something that is unrealistic at this fuel rate for this particular takeoff. So I want to just point out those anomalies at this point. Now, what is most important in this situation is to recognize that the sky pointer and slip skid indicator is the primary area that you need to focus for getting this aircraft in a aerodynamic configuration to operate correctly. Now, when I say that, I'm talking in regard to roll, I'm talking in regard to an autopilot being engaged or maintaining engagement. So I want you to recognize that this area of focus is most important, and we can see we have a proper indication here for what would be realistic in this situation of a left engine failed and a right engine operating, because you've got that skid indicator operating engine, and therefore you step on this skid indicator. So I can't emphasize enough how important your focus and attention should have a high percentage of focus on that slip skid indicator. And again, as I had mentioned, one of the anomalies here in a simple engine failure, it spools back, and this is not realistic. It shows that you would have a failure, but the RPM would be spooling back, and it would be much higher than that as it's windmilling. The other thing that's most important, as we've covered before in the in-flight, the fuel flow on the operating engine is going to be an important thing to have as part of your flow pattern for stabilization when you get airborne. With a bigger scale here, I'm showing you what we've got here. We've got the sky pointer with the skids indicator over here to the right, and that's a realistic situation for a left engine failure with the right engine operating. Now, the one thing too that I want to really point out with this situation, and I said it in the previous module, but it's even more important here, as I'll discuss later. Don't rely on this roll cue. Now, in fact, in this presentation here, one of the things that is realistic, we've had an engine failure. You can see the skid indicator is over here, and notice that the roll cue is centered up. But here you have an out of coordinated flight condition with a rudder. The aileron rudder connect is not operating in a normal manner, and therefore this roll indicator is confused. And when it's confused, what it does is center up. So keep that in mind. Be very careful of using this for any kind of alignment as you're on the runway. Now here we are. This is a low visibility takeoff with a 500 RVR. Now this doesn't have runway centerline lights, and you know in the real world you would have that. But here we have the center line of the runway. And notice you're not really seeing much. This is a rain condition as well. But here's what I want to start to point out, gang. When you have that engine failure, use your brain to help you with the rudder application to stay aligned to the runway center line. Or if you drift a little bit off that center line, apply rudder to parallel that center line. But here's my point. Here's my main point. Shaka bra, my main point. Look outside. Do not rely on the roll cue for alignment to the center line or alignment of the aircraft. Here's what happens. This is the human factor that very often happens with most of us. When we have that condition of an engine failure and this low visibility, and I can't see down the runway, the natural instinct is to come in and look at this roll cue. And that roll cue is not operating correctly. And I can tell you in those situations, I have seen very few successful take when they've used the cue to line up, and just luck that you get off the runway before you excurse off of the runway. Please, please, please understand this human factor, that my natural tendency will be to go here, really overcome that, and stay out there for the alignment portion. That is most important, most critical. So as I go into this, and notice I try to really emphasize, stop the lateral drift. And you stop the lateral drift visually. If you try and do it here, I can almost assure you that you're going to go off the runway. Now, this is a technique, and it's a technique I'm sharing with you. You decide, practice with it, and see if it works. I know that many cases here throughout my time with teaching this, when individuals were having some problems, this really worked. Maintain the visual on that center line. I guess I've said it 3 or 4 times now, so hopefully you have the point. Do not use that roll cue. Now, another thing that's critical that I want to emphasize, when the runway drift is stable and you are ready to rotate because you're stable on the runway, start the rotation, maintain, as we had in the previous slide, visual cues to that center line as long as you can. And you know what? That's going to be just a fraction of a second. Because as soon as you start the rotation, that should disappear. But in the initial part of the rotation, maintains a visual out there and then immediately transition into the pitch cue. But this is most important. Maintain outside. And again, it's just a fraction of a second. But when you start that rotation, what's important, again, I'm emphasizing here, the tendency is to, in extremely low visibility, to revert to the roll cue. And because you're at the point here where you're outside and you've got to come inside to start your rotation. So recognize that's kind of almost an instantaneous transition, but make sure that you maintain that visual condition as long as you can. So this is important. This is where it's most important here too. Because once you start that rotation, make it continuous and at a moderate rate, not stopping anywhere. Because if you make a slow rotation, if you kind of stop at 10 degrees or so, there's a good chance at most flap settings that we use for takeoff now, you will return to the runway. My foot, make that rotation continuous with a good rate, right up to 13.5 degrees, even 15 degrees. And that pitch cue is going to settle down well at safe speed. You need to get off the runway. And you need to get off the runway by staying over the runway until the landing gear are off the ground and you're safely in the air. Then a little bit of drift isn't going to be that much of a problem. But what you need to do is recognize that in this transition from runway alignment stabilization to I'm now starting to rotate, as you think and start that rotation, look outside, then immediately come inside to your pitch. Get the aircraft off the ground to the pitch indicator and apply the same amount of rudder that you had applied during the alignment, and then you'll fine tune it here later. Do not stop that continuous rotation. I've covered the problems with it, because if you don't get up there to 13.5 degrees, chances are you're going to return to the runway, especially if it's a combination of a very slow rotation. Oh, the engine's failed here. I can't be normal about this. I have to be ginger about it. No, make a normal rotation and hold that rudder initially once you're in the air to what was applied during the rotation. Again, I just want to cover the flow pattern here a little bit. This is once you come up, you make your rotation, get that pipper up into the pitch bar. Notice that this is right about 12.5 degrees. But chances are that's going to give you even more of a pitch once it stabilizes. The other thing that I'll talk about later is, remember, if you take off at a reduced power setting, you still have a little bit more power, but it's really important you handle that properly too at this situation. And I wouldn't even consider doing anything about it during that initial couple hundred feet. So when you have a positive rate of climb and it's confirmed, and you make sure you confirm it too on your vertical speed indicator, raise the gear, note the skid displacement, and then start to make an adjustment with your foot pressure. You can start to apply some foot pressure to start to center that skid indicator. But here's when it starts to get most important. Note the operating engine fuel flow. And in most cases, you're going to see at some of these reduced power settings, even some that are a little bit higher, it's going to be somewhere around 5, maybe at the most 7 units. And what you're going to do is reach back to the rudder control, and I've got this emphasis here, you don't have to look, stay focused here. I should be able to braille my way back to the rudder control and do it just on feel. Trim to relieve the foot pressure roughly to the units of fuel flow. And you are going to be able to have a good flying aircraft at that point, even to the point that if you get that skid and sky pointer aligned, you now will have a much more reliable roll cue. Do not rely on that roll cue. At this particular point, rely for heading on your nav display. If you got a magenta line there, that's the thing to rely on more so than here in this kind of condition. And notice how this is still centered up from some of the previous slides here, but look at how far out of aerodynamic symmetric flight this aircraft is. So be very careful of that, and we're going to talk about how important that is on an approach. All right, gang, this is the end of that particular segment, a failure at low visibility and at V1. The next part is going to be the airborne to flap retraction, the techniques of how to really fine-tune the stabilization of the aircraft for continuing the flight. And then I'm going to throw some real-world considerations and decisions. In training, you don't do that. Very much depends on how your training department handles this, how your FAA allows it. Some of it gets so canned, you're not really learning anything out of it other than to just control the aircraft. But you better start thinking about the human factors of what I'm going to have to do in making some decisions from the point of getting the aircraft safely airborne, identify the problem, start to run the checklist, and then be making some decisions that you have to on getting the aircraft back to the ground. We'll talk about those things. So preparation for landing and the approach considerations, we're going to cover those as well. So anyway, that's it, gang, and I hope some of this stuff is giving you an opportunity to think about some things that you can practice during training, that you can think about applying. And remember, these are techniques that I've learned and I've seen and been taught over the years. They work. But recognize that if your airline has certain procedures and other ways that they're having you handle any situation. That's a priority over anything that I talk about here. Thanks, gang, for your time and attention. God bless you. Keep that little old lady from Pasadena safe. Ciao.